50. Just 50 Celtic warriors, mud-stained, silent, invisible beneath the ancient Germanic forest canopy, marching toward them. 2,000 heavily armored Roman soldiers, veterans of an empire that had conquered nations with tens of thousands. Yet here, inside these twisting wooden corridors of mist and moss, numbers became meaningless. How did a tiny band of forest-born fighters shatter a Roman column 20 times their size? What secret terrain trap did they construct that even Roman scouts failed to notice? What flaw, buried deep within Rome's pride, turned this march into a massacre the empire tried to erase? This is the hidden story behind the Teutoburg nightmare, where the forest itself became a weapon, and the impossible became reality. The forest greeted them first before any enemy, before any sign of rebellion, an ancient cathedral of twisting branches that swallowed sunlight and softened every footstep. To the Romans, it felt like entering the lungs of a beast, inhaling them deeper with every mile. This was not the open terrain they were trained to dominate. This was Germania, wild, breathing, watchful. The legionaries marched in heavy armor, their red cloaks dampened by the morning mist. Yet beneath their disciplined rhythm throbbed an unease they dared not voice. Rome had conquered deserts, mountains, and kingdoms, blessed by sun and stone. But here, even the air felt foreign. Every rustle, every distant bird cry sounded less like nature and more like a warning. Across these same woods, unseen behind veils of moss and fog, Celtic and Germanic warriors moved like whispers. Among them walked Arminius, the man Rome believed was loyal, a decorated auxiliary commander, shaped by Roman discipline, yet shaped even more deeply by the memories Rome tried to erase. In his silence grew the storm that would rewrite history. The stakes were more than military. They were spiritual. For the tribes, this forest was not just land, it was ancestor, protector, judge. To let Rome claim it was to surrender the heartbeat of their identity. As the Roman columns stretched farther and thinner along the narrow path, wagons creaked, horses snorted nervously, and the officers exchanged glances they pretended not to notice. Something was wrong, something beyond tactics and terrain. It lingered in the damp air like a prophecy unraveling. When night approached, the last rays of light died behind the towering silhouettes of ancient trees, trees that had watched empires rise and fall long before Rome ever marched. And in that fading glow, the truth settled upon the forest like a whisper. The storm had already begun. Dawn crept reluctantly across the dense Germanic canopy, its pale light barely piercing the layers of mist that clung to the earth like ghostly fingers. Within this dim hush, the Roman column advanced, armor clinking softly, breaths forming clouds in the cold air. But beneath that rigid discipline, something fragile trembled. Fear. It didn't march openly. It slithered into the minds of soldiers who had seen deserts burn and mountains bleed, but had never faced an enemy who could become the forest itself. Every narrow turn of the trail, every patch of silence, felt like a throat tightening around them. The scouts were late again. The paths seemed to twist in ways even their maps did not promise. And somewhere between the creaking wagons and the muffled footfalls, the Roman officers sensed it. Morale was thinning. Some soldiers whispered that the tribes they pursued had vanished too easily. Others claimed they saw movement shadows darting between trunks, impossible to confirm, yet impossible to forget. The centurions barked orders to steady the ranks, but even their voices felt subdued, swallowed by towering pines that seemed to lean in, listening. Meanwhile, far ahead in the unseen corridors of the forest, 50 Celtic warriors gathered in silence. Their hearts hammered too, not from fear of death, but from the weight of what they were about to attempt. To fail meant annihilation for their families, their clans, their way of life. Many touched the earth before rising, whispering to the spirits of their ancestors for strength. Their bodies trembled, but their resolve blazed brighter than any Roman torch. 2 armies, 2 fears, one rising, one transforming into determination. Between them, the forest held its breath. And somewhere, deep in that living maze of shadows and roots, the first invisible thread of fate pulled tighter. A quiet reminder that pressure is what turns ordinary men into legends or into ghosts. The deeper the Romans marched, the smaller their world became. Gone were the open plains where legions could spread their wings in perfect, disciplined formation. Here, the path wound like a serpent, narrow, slick, and choked by roots older than any empire. Towering trees formed walls of shadow that pressed close on either side, reducing thousands of soldiers into a single stretched, fragile line. The forest was no longer scenery. It was architecture constructed by nature to humble invaders. Rain began as a whisper, then thickened to a curtain that soaked cloaks and muddied sandals. Armor that once gleamed with imperial pride turned heavy and cold. Shields slipped. Horses snorted uneasily. Supply wagons struggled through the rising sludge. Each mile pulled the legion deeper into exhaustion, deeper into dependence on a terrain they could neither read nor trust. Unbeknownst to them, every misstep had already been measured. High above, on ridges hidden by ferns and fog, Celtic scouts observed with unwavering patience. They counted supply wagons. They mapped the Roman columns' stretched length. They studied which officers hesitated, where the march stuttered, where fear pooled. Every tree, every slope, every narrow bend was a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. Along the trail, subtle signs began to appear, though too faint, for Roman eyes trained to fight men, not landscapes. A pile of disturbed earth, a suspiciously thinned section of underbrush, a wooden frame buried beneath moss. These were the beginnings of the trap. Pits disguised as puddles, barricades hidden beneath foliage, choke points arranged to cripple movement. Arminius himself rode calmly with the Romans ahead, his face unreadable. Inside, he felt the forest aligning with him, both predator and ally. He needed only to guide the Romans a little deeper, a little more off balance, before the jaws closed. Thunder growled across the canopy like an omen. The Romans tightened their cloaks and pressed onward, unaware that with each step, the forest was quietly removing their ability to retreat, regroup, or even breathe freely. And then came the moment that unsettled even seasoned veterans. A Roman horn sounded clear, strong, but the forest did not echo it back. It simply swallowed the sound whole. It happened subtly at first, so small an event that no Roman officer would have imagined it could unravel an empire's confidence. A wagon wheel, swollen from rain and mud, snapped with a sharp crack that echoed like a breaking omen. The supply cart lurched sideways, blocking the already narrow path. Soldiers rushed to clear it, slipping in the mire, while the marching line behind them compressed into a tense, breathing bottleneck. Then came the second sign. A scout, usually punctual, failed to return. The centurions exchanged taut glances. None spoke the fear aloud, but all felt the same chill threaded through the air. The forest had grown too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the soft, eerie patter of rain on leaves. Arminius watched the confusion bloom with a calmness that would have terrified the Romans had they seen it. He had guided them precisely where he needed them. Trapped between rising marshland and an incline so steep, even seasoned climbers would hesitate. Their formations were scattered, their officers frustrated, and the line severed in multiple places by natural choke points. Then a shadow moved, a flicker of motion between trees, too swift, too controlled to be an animal. A Roman at the front barked a command, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. More shadows emerged, then more, not approaching, encircling. To the Celtic warriors, this was the moment their ancestors had prepared them for. Hearts steady, breath silent, every muscle coiled with purpose. 50 men, hidden within the ancient cathedral of branches, felt the signal pass through them like lightning. The time for stillness was over. The Romans sensed it. Something intangible shifting around them, the pressure rising like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. And then, a horn sounded from the woods. Not Roman, low, primal, and unyielding. The trap had sprung, and for the first time, the legions understood they were not marching through a forest. They were marching into a mouth that had just closed. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then the forest exhaled. It began with a rumble not of thunder, but of feet moving in perfect, fluid coordination above the ridges and behind the pines. Leaves shivered though no wind blew. A low hum vibrated through the earth beneath Roman sandals. The legionaries, already stretched thin by terrain and exhaustion, felt the tremor before they understood it. Then the roar came. A Celtic war horn blasted across the canopy, deep as the groan of an ancient beast awakening from centuries of sleep. Its echo rolled like storm waves, triggering a cascade of answering calls hidden across the hills. Romans spun toward the sound, shields lifting on instinct, but the echoes ricocheted wildly, masking the attacker's position. Every direction felt like the right one and the wrong one. Rain hammered harder. Mud swallowed footsteps. The Roman column convulsed, trying to form ranks, but the pathway allowed no order. Shields scraped against roots. Javelins snagged in branches. Officers shouted commands that vanished into the thunder of the forest. Then, from the mist, figures emerged. Not in ranks, not in waves, but in illusions, blurs of bodies, glints of iron, flickers of movement between trees. The Celts attacked like the forest itself had chosen to slash, strike, and vanish. A warrior would appear on a ridge, release a spear, and dissolve back into the green void before Roman eyes could adjust. Another would leap from behind a fallen trunk, disappearing before the legion could counter. Every Roman advance was swallowed, every defensive formation collapsed on the uneven ground. Soldiers slipped, shields tangled, armor dragged them down as mud clung like living hands. The forest amplified Celtic agility and stripped the Romans of every advantage they once held sacred. The horns grew louder, closer, more numerous. The Romans felt the walls closing, not stone walls, but living ones, bark, roots, branches, shadows. It was no longer a battle. It was an awakening. And as the Celts tightened the circle, using terrain as blade and shield, the Romans sensed a truth more terrifying than death. The forest was fighting with the warriors. The worst had not yet arrived. The storm broke fully now, not from the sky, but from the forest itself. What had begun as scattered strikes and ghost-like attacks now converged into a single crushing force. The Romans, drenched and caked in mud, attempted once more to form a defensive wall. But the terrain mocked them. The narrow path twisted sharply. The marsh on one side swallowed their footing. The slope on the other denied any lateral movement. They were caged animals in armor, far too heavy for escape. Centurions bellowed orders, voices hoarse, echoing through fog that seemed to absorb sound rather than carry it. Hold the line, close ranks. But no line could hold when the very ground beneath them tore their formation apart. Shields tilted at awkward angles. Spears scraped uselessly against dripping branches. The legion's iron discipline, its greatest weapon, crumbled under the weight of nature's chaos. Then the Celts descended. Not in a wave, but in a rhythm-precise bursts of coordinated strikes. A warrior would appear on a ridge and unleash a rain of projectiles. Another would emerge from a ravine, using the uneven terrain to launch attacks from unexpected heights. Their feet seemed untouched by the mud that swallowed Roman sandals. Their bodies bent with the forest, moved with it, vanished into it. Panic spread like wildfire. A standard-bearer slipped and fell, the eagle of Rome plunging into the mud, a symbol the legionaries were trained to protect with their lives. Men surged instinctively to retrieve it, but the terrain funneled them into a choke point where Celtic fighters waited with perfect timing. The collision shattered what little cohesion remained. Arminius watched it unfold with grim resolve. Rome had given him its education, its strategies, its arrogance. The forest gave him everything else. Here, those worlds collided, and Rome's world was losing. The final moments were not a heroic stand, nor a decisive clash. They were a slow, suffocating collapse. The Romans, overwhelmed by environment and fear, broke into fragments. Some tried to retreat, only to find the path blocked. Others attempted to scale the slopes, slipping back into the mud. For the first time, the legions understood something unthinkable. They were not fighting 50 warriors. They were fighting a battlefield designed to destroy them. And the forest had delivered its verdict. When the final echoes of horns and shouts faded, an uncanny hush settled over the forest, so complete it felt unnatural, as if the very air refused to remember the violence that had taken place. The rain softened to a mist, drifting through broken branches and abandoned Roman gear scattered along the trail. Bent shields lay half-buried in mud. Splintered wagon frames leaned like wounded beasts. The world looked frozen in the aftermath of something enormous, something that had reshaped more than a battlefield. Celtic warriors emerged slowly from the foliage, breathing hard, faces streaked with rain and soil. There were no triumphant cries, no raised weapons. Victory in the forest was never a celebration, it was survival. And survival carried its own weight. Some knelt, pressing hands to the earth in silent gratitude. Others searched the woods for comrades who had vanished into the storm of movement and mud. Relief and grief mingled quietly beneath the dripping canopy. Arminius stood apart, watching the mist curl through the ruins of the Roman column. He understood the enormity of what had happened. Rome would not forget this, nor forgive it. Yet the tribes had bought something priceless, a future free from imperial chains, at least for a time. Far away, the few Roman survivors staggered through the trees, numb and trembling, carrying home a message no emperor wished to hear. Back in Rome, shockwaves tore through the Senate. The defeat was not merely tactical, it was psychological, existential. It marked the edge of Rome's ambition. The forest, meanwhile, returned to its ancient silence. But that silence was not emptiness, it was memory. And it would echo through history for centuries to come. Long after the last footprints faded into the undergrowth, the forest remained a silent witness to a moment that would reshape the fate of empires. Mist drifted between ancient trunks like wandering spirits, carrying whispers of the battle that had unfolded beneath their branches. To walk this ground was to feel history, not as words on a scroll, but as weight in the chest, a reminder that even the greatest powers can be humbled by forces older and deeper than ambition. In Rome, scholars and senators would argue over the defeat, blaming weather, commanders, luck, anything but the truth. The truth was that humanity had clashed not merely with warriors, but with a culture rooted so deeply in its land that the soil itself seemed to rise against invaders. Numbers had failed, discipline had failed, pride had failed. What endured was resilience, tribal, ancestral, raw. Arminius understood this more than anyone. He had seen both worlds, Rome's polished steel and Germania's living spirit. His triumph was not one of brutality, but of identity reclaimed. And in that reclamation lay a lesson echoed through centuries. Empires may draw borders, but they cannot conquer the soul of a land unwilling to kneel. The forest's silence now felt different, not empty, but sacred. Every branch, every stone, every fold of earth seemed infused with the memory of those who fought to keep this place their own. The Romans would never again dare push this deeply into Germania. The boundary was set not by treaties, but by the will of a people who refused to be forgotten. And so the forest kept its secrets, holding them gently beneath moss and shadow. A reminder that some victories are not carved in marble, but in the memory of the earth itself,